There's a moment, you probably don't talk about it, when someone looks at you a certain way, half judgment, half assumption, like they've already decided who you are, before you've even said a full sentence. And the strange part is, sometimes you don't even correct them, you just let them believe it. Because explaining yourself feels exhausting, or maybe a little pointless. I want you to sit with that for a second, because if you're here watching me right now, there's a good chance you've been misunderstood more times than you can count. Not because you are simple, but because people only saw the surface you allowed them to see. And I'm going to say something gently, but honestly. There are moments when a man becomes too convenient in someone's mind. Not dangerous, not complex, just predictable. Easy to assume, easy to misread. And once that label sticks, it changes how they move around you. But here's where it gets interesting, and a little uncomfortable. Sometimes it's not what they think about you that matters most. It's what you stopped showing them. Before we go deeper into that, if this is landing somewhere close to home, don't just scroll away, stay with me. And if you find yourself reflecting even a little, it might be worth subscribing, because these conversations aren't loud, but they tend to stay with you long after. Now, let's talk about what really happens when someone misreads your intention. There are men who are labeled as too available, too direct, maybe even too focused on physical connection. But what people don't see is the emotional context behind it, the loneliness that didn't have words, the hunger for connection that got expressed in the simplest, most misunderstood way. And over time, something shifts. You start noticing patterns. People don't challenge you anymore. They don't lean in emotionally. They keep things light, superficial, controlled. And you might tell yourself you don't care, but you do notice. Of course you do, because deep down, every human being wants to be seen accurately, not just reacted to. And here's the part most people miss entirely. When you're misread long enough, you start adapting to the misreading. You begin to perform the version of yourself people already expect. Not because it's who you are, but because it's easier than correcting them every single time. And that's where the real shift begins. Not in how they see you, but in how you start to disappear from your own expression. I've seen this in men who are anything but simple. Men with depth, restraint, emotional intelligence, but buried under layers of learned behavior that once made social survival easier. And then one day, something changes. Not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly. People start paying attention differently. Not because you became someone new, but because you stopped over-explaining who you were trying to be. And that's where this story really begins. Because what happens next is rarely what you expect. You start noticing it in small moments first. A pause that lasts half a second longer than usual when someone replies to your message. A shift in tone, subtle, almost imperceptible, like they're recalibrating how they speak to you. And you don't fully understand it at the time, but something in the dynamic is changing. Here's what I want you to consider carefully. People don't just respond to what you say, they respond to what they believe you are while you're saying it. And once that internal image of you starts to shift, everything else follows. There was a version of you they thought they understood. Simple, predictable, emotionally readable, maybe even easy to access without effort. But now, something feels off to them. Not in a bad way, not in a dramatic way, in a curious way, like they missed something important the first time. And this is where many men misunderstand what's happening. They think they need to do more to fix perception, more attention, more effort, more explanation. But psychologically, that usually pushes people further away. Because over-explaining creates noise, not clarity. Let me say this more directly. When someone starts re-evaluating you, the most powerful thing you can do is not rush to define yourself again. It's to allow space for their perception to reorganize on its own. Silence, when used correctly, doesn't disappear you. It reframes you. And I don't mean silence in a manipulative way. I mean emotional restraint, not performing every thought, not filling every gap, not trying to be instantly understood. There's a difference between being open and being overexposed. And somewhere along the way, many men confuse the two. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. When you stop over-signaling who you are, people begin to project less onto you and observe more of you. And observation is dangerous for assumptions, because assumptions are lazy. They rely on patterns, but observation creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, emotionally speaking, is where attraction begins to deepen, not because of mystery as a tactic, but because the mind hates unresolved questions about people it can't easily categorize anymore. So when she looks at you differently now, it's not random, it's recalibration. She's noticing inconsistencies between what she thought you were and what she's starting to feel around you. And that creates internal tension, because the story she built about you is no longer fully working. But here's the part most men never see coming. That tension doesn't always push people away. Sometimes it pulls them closer. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped leaking everything you are too quickly. And now they're forced to slow down, to pay attention, to reconsider. And in that reconsideration, something subtle begins to form. Respect, curiosity, re-engagement. But it doesn't feel obvious at first. It feels like hesitation mixed with attention, distance mixed with return. And if you're not careful, you'll misread that shift as rejection, when in reality, it's the beginning of recalibration in your favor. There's a moment in this process where you might feel tempted to step in and fix the emotional gap. But that's exactly where many men undo everything quietly building beneath the surface. Because what's forming isn't built through pursuit, it's built through contrast. And contrast only exists when you stop trying to close every emotional space immediately. The question now isn't what they think of you anymore, it's what they're slowly realizing they don't fully understand about you. And that realization changes everything. There's a strange phase that follows this shift, and most men don't recognize it while it's happening. At first, it feels like distance. Not hostility, not rejection, just distance that wasn't there before. She replies, but not as quickly. She engages, but with more thought. Sometimes she even seems slightly distracted, like part of her attention is somewhere you can't quite reach. And if you're not grounded in what's really happening, your mind starts filling in the blanks. Did I do something wrong? Did I lose her interest? Should I step up more? But here's the truth underneath all of that noise. This isn't disinterest, it's cognitive reorganization. Her mind is trying to reconcile two versions of you, the version she thought she understood, and the version she's now encountering through subtle inconsistencies in behavior, tone, presence. And when the brain can't resolve a contradiction quickly, it does something very human. It replays, it reanalyzes, it repositions you internally. And that process doesn't look romantic from the outside. It looks like confusion. It looks like emotional hesitation. It looks like a woman pulling slightly back, not because she's leaving, but because she's thinking. Now, this is the part where many men accidentally collapse the entire dynamic. They panic in silence. They try to restore certainty too quickly. More messages, more availability, more clarity. But certainty, when forced, kills curiosity. And curiosity is what's quietly been growing in the background. Because here's something people rarely admit out loud. When someone becomes harder to categorize emotionally, they become more mentally present in your life, not less. You think distance means loss, but psychologically, distance without closure often increases internal focus. And I want you to be honest with yourself here. There's a difference between being wanted because you're easy to access and being thought about because you're not fully solved. One creates comfort, the other creates attention. And attention, over time, starts to shift behavior. She starts remembering small details she didn't prioritize before. She notices tone changes. She rereads messages with a different interpretation. Not because you changed dramatically, but because her internal model of you is no longer stable. And unstable perceptions don't rest easily. They seek resolution. Now here's where things become emotionally complex. Because during this phase, you might feel the urge to step forward and prove you're not what she assumed. But proving creates pressure, and pressure pulls people back into certainty, not curiosity. What actually works here is far more subtle and far more uncomfortable for most men. You remain consistent without over-explaining, present without overreaching, engaged without chasing emotional validation. And in that space, something begins to happen that she can't fully control. She starts to initiate more internally, even if not externally. She thinks about you at unexpected times. Not because you are demanding attention, but because you stopped feeding predictable emotional responses into the dynamic. And unpredictability, when it feels safe rather than chaotic, creates emotional imprint. There's a moment where she might even test the dynamic, a casual message, a slightly more personal question, a return to warmth that feels like it wasn't there before. And if you're not aware of the pattern, you'll think everything is back to normal. But it isn't. It's evolved. Because now she's not interacting with the version of you she assumed. She's interacting with the version she's still trying to understand. And that version is no longer easy to place. And when a man stops being easy to place, he stops being easy to forget. There's a point in this dynamic where something shifts again, but it's quieter this time. No dramatic message, no sudden confession, no obvious turning point. Just consistency from her side that wasn't there before. A hey that doesn't need a reason. A check-in that feels slightly more personal than before. A response time that starts to mirror your rhythm instead of ignoring it. And if you're not paying attention closely, you might miss what's really happening underneath it. This isn't pursuit in the way people imagine it. It's re-engagement after uncertainty. Because the mind doesn't like unfinished emotional equations. And when someone who once felt figured out becomes slightly less predictable, the brain starts working to stabilize them again. But here's the key detail most men misunderstand. She's not trying to get you back. She's trying to understand where she stands with you now. That's a very different emotional position, and it changes everything about how she interacts. You might notice she becomes more attentive to your tone, more aware of pauses, more sensitive to how quickly or slowly you respond. Not because she's playing a game, but because she's recalibrating emotional safety. And safety in this context is not about control. It's about clarity. Now here's where your internal response matters more than anything she does. Because this is the phase where many men unconsciously overcorrect. They become warmer than necessary, more available than before, more eager to restore normality. But normality is not what's been rebuilt here. Something new is forming, and if you rush it, you flatten it. Let me say this carefully. When someone starts re-engaging after emotional uncertainty, they are not returning to the old dynamic. They are testing a new one, and your behavior either confirms growth or collapses it back into familiarity. There's a quiet psychological tension here, because she's now paying attention not just to your presence, but to your restraint. To whether you still feel emotionally predictable, to whether you still overreach when there's space to simply be. And if she notices you are not rushing to fill every gap, something subtle begins to take shape. Respect deepens, but not the loud kind. The kind that changes how she speaks to you when she's slightly tired. The kind that shows up in how she pauses before responding. The kind that makes her consider her words more carefully than before. And underneath that, there's something even more delicate forming. Investment. Not because you demanded it, but because you no longer diluted your presence trying to secure it. Now, I want you to notice something very carefully in your own experience. There's a difference between being emotionally available and being emotionally structured. One reacts, the other holds. And what she's responding to now is not intensity, it's stability under ambiguity. Because most people can handle clarity, very few can handle someone who doesn't collapse when clarity is removed. And that's what quietly shifts the entire emotional hierarchy. Not dominance, not control, but composure. And when a man stops overreacting to emotional uncertainty, he becomes significantly harder to displace in someone's mind. Because now, she's not just interacting with your attention anymore, she's interacting with your emotional baseline. And that is where things begin to change in a way she didn't anticipate. There's a moment, usually quiet, almost anticlimactic, when you realize the dynamic has fully turned. Not because someone announces it, not because anything dramatic happens, but because you feel it in the way she shows up now. More intentional, more grounded, less casual than before. And if you're honest with yourself, there's a slight disbelief at first, because this isn't what you expected when everything felt uncertain. But here's the truth that sits underneath it all. People don't chase what they fully understand. They lean into what they feel they're still learning. And somewhere along the way, you stopped being fully readable in the way you once were. Not because you became distant, but because you became more deliberate with your emotional presence. Now, let me be clear about something important. This isn't about winning someone over. It's not about reversing roles or creating emotional confusion on purpose. What actually shifts things is far more internal than that. It's the moment you stop leaking your emotional state to everyone who interacts with you. It's when your reactions stop being immediate explanations of how you feel, and instead become measured reflections of what you choose to express. That creates a different kind of presence, one that doesn't demand attention, but naturally holds it. And when someone has been recalibrating their perception of you over time, they don't just see your actions anymore. They feel your consistency. They notice what no longer fluctuates. They recognize what doesn't bend under emotional pressure. And that recognition builds something deeper than curiosity. It builds trust in your stability, even if they don't consciously name it that way. Now here's the part that might stay with you longer than anything else I've said. The shift was never really about them begging or chasing. That language misses the real transformation entirely. What actually happens is quieter. People begin to adjust how they relate to you because the emotional frame around you has changed. They approach differently. They speak differently. They invest differently. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped over-informing them about who you are at every moment. And in that space, they're finally left to experience you without shortcuts. But I want you to sit with something a little deeper before this ends. The most powerful change in all of this isn't how others respond to you. It's how you stop abandoning yourself in real time just to be understood quickly. Because when you stop doing that, you don't just change your relationships. You change the way you occupy your own presence. And people can feel that, even before they understand it. There's a calm that replaces urgency, a steadiness that replaces explanation, and a quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself to be recognized. So if there's anything to take from this, it's not the idea of reversal or control. It's the realization that being deeply understood is not always about being fully revealed. Sometimes, it's about being experienced slowly enough that others finally catch up to who you already are. And when that happens, nothing about your presence feels accidental anymore. It feels chosen. And that changes everything.